What will the relationship between China and France be like for the next 60 years? What about that between China and the EU for the next 50 years? Well, these are very big questions, too early to tell. However, as China is welcoming the French president's visit to the country, Chinese President Xi Jinping has been advocating China and France should seek opportunities to expand cooperation. He said this on Thursday as he welcomed the French President Emmanuel Macron in Beijing. They jointly witnessed the signing of several cooperation documents on nuclear energy, agriculture, food, education, and ecological environment after their talks. President Macron from France's state visit to China from Wednesday to Friday is a reciprocal visit to Chinese President Xi's historic state visit to France last year that marked 60th anniversary of China-France diplomatic relations. So what is the significance of this interaction between the two presidents, between China and France? What progress has been made in China-EU relations related to this? How the two sides can ensure steady, sustained development going forward? All these questions hopefully can be answered by our panel. Joining us in London, Ian Beck, professor with the European Institute from London School of Economics and Political Science. In Berlin, Ulrike Brugner, Jean Monnet Professor for European Studies with Stanford University. In Beijing, Baocheng Liu, Director from the Center of International Business Ethics with the University of International Business and Economics. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, in a joint press conference, Chinese President Xi Jinping, Mr. Beck, talk about the 4 points of important consensus between China and France. Both sides agreed to enhance political mutual trust, expand practical cooperation, promote people-to-people and cultural exchanges, and advance the reform and improvement of global governance, just to name a few. Now, how many of these areas do you think there can be a lot of fruitful results and those results can be implemented?
The trouble with all four of the words you used is that they are very soft. They're not easy to measure. And therefore, one of the problems is turning these warm words into realistic and implementable programs. And that's where Europe, China in general, and Europe, France in particular, has struggled over recent years because of pressures coming from other parts of the world, not least the other side of the Atlantic. Also, to some extent, someone like Macron being in China is a visit on behalf of Europeans, but France is always very well known for promoting French interests above everybody else's. And I'll be interested to hear from your other guest whether he thinks Germany endorses some of what Macron is trying to do. But there are at least two overarching challenges which Macron is trying to promote, and that is to try to get some support from China on ending the war in Ukraine. There's a perception in much of Europe that China is quietly backing the Russian side, and therefore trying to persuade China to do more to end that war will be very important. And the second, obviously very significant, is the trade relations, which, because of all the friction with Washington, European trade organizers will want to see more going on with major trading nations like China.
Mr. Brugner, when it comes to French's role in within the EU and also on some of the key points that we just mentioned, how much political capital does the president of France have in making sure these 4 points can be implemented?
In a world that reports a lot about strong men saying this and pointing in that direction, in America, in China, in Russia, media is eager to find strong men in Europe. So if a French president is coming to the country, people expect that this is equally a leader. While when I speak to people in the European Commission last week or in the German capital this week, it was hardly taken into consideration what might be the outcome of what the Élysée strictly describes as a bilateral meeting between France and China. So on the one hand, no one really expects major changes from this visit. On the other hand, given that the European Union is not a united federation, but sovereign states form this supranational entity, it is important for France to address French interests. But at the end of the day, the 4 points that you mentioned are essential to address all the challenging problems that we face in the 21st century. Without this, which is basically boiling down to trust, we cannot move on with investment agreements or managing globalization in a better way.
The Chinese president mentioned about creating mutual trust, enhance political trust between the two countries. How important these strategic consensus are in terms of building trust and maintaining trust?
One is that together we can identify the common areas of interest and shared not only for these two countries but also for the future development. And so, second is that the multi-level of engagement in dialogue and also in mutual exchange. And third would be that we need another renewed roadmap as how we can really move forward. And lastly, how can we really contain those differences that are there, presenting the roadblock for further collaboration and for further trust building?
Mr. Begg, your interpretation?
In part, that it's also a fourth word you need to consider, and that's suspicion. There's a degree of suspicion in Europe, probably most intense in the United Kingdom rather than in the European Union, about China's activities. So it goes beyond rivalry and competition. Sometimes it's saying, should we be concerned about what China is doing in its global activities? And part of the rationale for having meetings like that between Macron and President Xi this week is precisely to try to tone down these kinds of suspicions, find ways around them. But it will not be easy because those of us who live in Europe see so much suspicion on a daily basis aimed at China that it is a difficult task to try to bring it back to mutual understanding and trust.
It's not just about how we talk about it, but also what are the facts.
Yeah.
And when we hear the Chinese foreign minister visiting Brussels in summer and mentioning that it's in China's interest to keep the war ongoing in Ukraine because it distracts the West from an Asian theater, then this is not necessarily a trust-building initiative. Because
on
Ian
that, I
rightly
need to quote before we have the rumors spreading. Some specific wording coming from the Chinese president talked openly about China's position on the Russian-Ukraine crisis. He said China has been supporting fair, lasting, binding, acceptable agreements for all sides, parties concerned. And China is opposing, meanwhile, shifting blames and smear others. One of the things China has been very concerned, I hope, Professor Liu, you can jump in on this issue as you're from China. It seems that cross-Atlantic relationship is right now experiencing some quite turbulence because both sides have very different opinions about how to resolve the Russian-Ukraine crisis. One party in that relationship might blame somebody else who is not directly involved at all in that crisis. Professor Liu.
First, China defends multilateralism and also defend UN Charter principles. And second, China wanted to maintain regular business activities with all partners around the world. And third, China wants to promote continued peaceful dialogue in order to address the historical legacies together with the current realities so that we will be able to achieve a more sustainable solution. So instead of flaking back and forth, right, particularly like the United States has been doing towards the political and geopolitical issues.
How much longer do you think the world needs to wait for the European or the EU plan for peace that will be accepted by both Russia and Ukraine?
Well, the world is not waiting for a European plan that will be accepted by anyone, because the Europeans strongly support Ukraine. But what we have seen in Alaska and what we have seen in the last days is a negotiation between the United States and Russia to formulate a position that discusses consequences for third parties, like in the initiative of the 28 points. It was the Europeans that should refinance the reconstruction and the United States get 50% of the profits. Such initiatives openly exclude the Europeans as an active player in the conflict. So even if the Europeans would come out with a plan that is in favor of Ukraine, because when you talk about a conflict, it sounds like it's an equal situation of two parties. But we have to be precise. You reminded me about wording is important. Russia is an invader, Russia is the aggressor, and Ukraine is the victim. And this is why the Europeans support Ukraine that defends its integrity of its territory. And therefore, it's very clear in what direction a European plan could lean. But that is not necessarily a reflection of the balance of power there. The 28 points were not a plan, that was a wish list by Russia. And what we saw in the week after in Geneva
can the EU,
was
can the European capitals persuade Washington to do otherwise?
Well, we don't know. We see the pendulum swinging back and forth. We had a Geneva agreement that was a position of Ukraine, the Europeans, and the United States, and it hasn't been published. Now we see bilateral talks again. Every talk, every attempt to find a diplomatic solution is very much appreciated. But in what direction the United States is leaning, we don't know, because there are clearly self-interests in Trump and its wider family and American interests in general that stand in the way to find a fair and balanced solution.
Ian, whether the Europeans think one way or the other way, does it really matter in terms of how things will result?
It is changing in two directions. One is that Europe is now committing itself to do what Donald Trump wants, namely to spend far more of its own resources on military support of all sorts, both for Ukraine and in raising the share of GDP spent on armaments. Germany is a strong case here, where the new government of Merz early this year immediately said we are going to spend more in defense and ramp up, tear up our normal fiscal constraints.
Yeah, I mean, despite what the European capitals are trying to do, that's one thing. But the question really is, does it matter what the European capitals are trying to do individually or collectively in the eventual results of the Russia-Ukraine crisis? Do you see that matter?
Yes,
to what extent?
I do see this, because part of what Trump has been imposing on Europe is Europe paying for the armaments being sent to Ukraine. So there's already an intervention in paying for some of the military support. But also, when it comes to European reconstruction, Europe is going to face the biggest part of the invoice for that reconstruction. So there's two immediate effects there. And that's the reason Europe says it's time you listen to our voice on the diplomatic maneuvers that are going on at present. And I think that message is cutting through. It is influencing the changing position of Washington, particularly of Marco Rubio, in how they deal with Ukraine.
Among some of the areas that I just read, coming from the joint presser, coming from the two presidents, what do you think can be promoting? What do you think can be key areas for Europe, for France, for example, to catch up and strengthen itself?
Well, when we go through the list, it's not about this one is more important or performing better than another. Because as we started with trust, it all boils down to trust, because we don't look at things anymore just as things, like a car drives you from A to B, but a car is securitized.
I know what you're getting at, but Ulrich, you know, there has been tremendous cooperation between, for example, German car makers and Chinese car makers, not only in the German market, but also in the international market. Well, you are saying this. So it's interesting. You don't think these companies knows what they're doing?
Well, we have to distinguish what are we talking about. There are German companies that are so massively invested in China that for them, de-risking means to invest more and to benefit from a fast-growing Chinese market. While a lot of other, like small and medium-sized global champions in Europe, rather move away because they can't afford the security risks in times in which everything is securitized. And this, again, is based on mutual trust. And we simply don't know enough about each other, or in some cases, we have asymmetric dependencies that, as we learned the hard way, are not the best investment.
Strategic autonomy is a word that has been used for quite some time. Any results, Ulrich?
Well, we are moving in a direction in which de-risking means that we diversify our dependencies or try to make them mutual.
Right.
In that sense, yes, we have come a long way. But on the other hand, we wouldn't, for example, meet our climate goals without technology that we could cheaply and efficiently import from China. So there is a mutual dependency, but we have to keep it balanced and not asymmetric, because that only causes security risks that can be instrumentalized in wording.
I see, Ian, very long wish list coming from our European colleagues, but how much will this wish list come true? At what cost? Whether businesses will be able to make that turn, and how much the consumers will bear the cost, and how much will that mean switching from one to another, which is also equally, arguably speaking, in terms of security, challenging, one could say.
Well, Europe is facing a dilemma because it's recognizing what it hadn't recognized before, which is fading in competitiveness, and needs to do something to boost that competitiveness. There was an important report by Mario Draghi last year which made this point. Part of what someone like Macron is doing in China is to encourage Chinese investment, to encourage collaboration, but it keeps coming up against this dichotomy between trust on the one side and suspicion on the other. And Ulrich has already articulated some of the suspicions. The suspicions are also purely economic, that China will win in a trade war, even though it's not a declared war between Europe and China, because China at the moment is better in so many things. Europe's challenge, therefore, is to implement many of the things in reports like the Draghi report. On the meetings taking place in China right now between Macron and all the Chinese leadership, not just President Xi Jinping, I think it's important to recognize that there are plenty of words, but there's one word which I would say has to be put in front of all of them, and that is delivery. Make sure things happen rather than that you talk warmly about them.
Right. There has been some concern, at least to the people that I've been talking to, Chinese businesses that are operating globally in Europe as well, about constant shifting of policy landscapes in Europe, and even shifting of rule of law, which the Europeans are very proud of for the past few decades. Now, Ulrich, how much attractive will Europe still be, including France, still be in front of the eyes of international investors? Many of them are coming from China.
Well, this is a very general question, and it all depends what exactly we are looking at. If we regulate artificial intelligence in times when we don't know in what direction we are heading with this disruptive technology, then Europe is first, and sometimes the Brussels effect, that the first mover sets a standard that the rest of the world is responding to, might play an important role for those who consider to invest in Europe or to do business with Europe. But in other areas, it's painful to watch how a bureaucratic system over-regulates everything, and then everyone shies away because it's simply too complicated, too expensive, too slow, and inefficient, given that a regulatory regime like the European Union sometimes is simply doing too much.
How much, Professor Liu, Baocheng, do you see that Chinese businesses are still interested in the European markets? And how do you see they are smartly navigating the water there?
I think definitely on a reciprocal basis, my analysis is that there's a large potential between the two sides in terms of mutual investment. Right now, nobody is really offering the more than 6% of their investment to each other, while there's a potential for another, at least 8%. So therefore, the recent survey shows that Chinese people put the Germany as a top priority, ideal destination for investment. Second would be France. So these are the opportunities they see is that okay, Europe is really lagging behind in terms of the digital transformation, particularly in the application part. China has an upper hand by collaborating with the fundamental research, which Europeans have really enjoyed an advantage by practical operation of China in the market proliferation. And second, Chinese companies from the e-cars to new energy batteries, etc. China is so eager. Now we park like 40% of our new batteries within Hungary, but we really want to use Hungary also as a hub and also a springboard to go to the north and also western part of Europe. And third is also logistics, because be it the freighter, be it the shipping lines, etc. So China wanted to really to secure more of the logistic hubs and also the centers for distribution within European ports and also within the European type of land deports, which they can really have more advantage in spreading to the end destinations, etc. What is expected, of course, is that Europe needs to streamline their bureaucracy and to bring better certainty, and also that Europe can really provide more of the surety in terms of the level of scrutiny over political consideration versus economic consideration.
Ian, your thoughts?
We shouldn't forget that Europe remains a major market. The European Union is somewhere just below 13% of global GDP. China is about 19, the US is about 16. But if you add nearby countries in Europe, Switzerland, Norway, the United Kingdom, Turkey, you find that this is still a very big bloc, and there are new members potentially joining it from the Western Balkans, as well as from Soviet Union countries, particularly Ukraine and Moldova. So there is going to be a big dynamic there, and that's going to be of interest to Chinese companies, to American companies, to Indian companies, anybody else.
Right.
So that's an important thing. It's also, as Professor Liu has said, a hub of innovation. There is innovation potential in Europe. It may not have been realized as much as it could be. And the one comment I'd make on what Ulrich Bruckner said is that there is a principle very often used in Europe called the precautionary principle. Don't do something until you can prove it's not risky. Whereas the American and maybe the Chinese approach is do something and then work out what to do with the risks if you discover them. That's the contrast between these areas.
Is that changing in Europe, do you think?
Not really, because the precautionary principle is deeply embedded. And here I say, especially in Germany.
My last question before we go. We are seeing a series of visits by the European politicians. How do you see the different European capitals trying bilaterally with Beijing, while at the same time putting pressure on Brussels to give China more challenge in terms of economic, trade, technology, and many other areas? Ian.
I think I've said before on World Insight that it's very difficult to say Europe in many cases because of the rivalries among European countries. It's not a coherent mass in the way the United States is. That said, there's a clear interest among the aggregate in Europe to regard China as important in all kinds of ways, and they will be striving to do that. That's why you see visits in which national leaders come with a combination of a European agenda and a national agenda.
If a member state of the European Union uses the collective weight of the European Union in bilateral relations, while at the same time you go in trips like the one with Macron, in which the French interests are different from the German interests that will be represented when our foreign minister is traveling to China and addresses German concerns. So from the other side, it would make perfect sense to divide the Europeans, because only if they speak united, it's easier to find a deal compared with a coherent position represented by the European Commission.
Together, we need to move forward to walk the walk by, the repairing of the mutual trust. And second, let's be very practical and move forward with something that's both sides desperately needed for synergy. And then, that let's, have a better engagement in dealing with, some of the challenges that both sides are really facing instead of pointing fingers to each other. So only by practical engagement, only by specific action and roadmaps, that can really be there to prove that the mutual trust or the collaborative, the good governance.
Baocheng, Ulrich, Ian, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it. Thank you.